Welcome to the Business Wingmen Show. I'm Steve Smith. My co-host Travis Smith is here with me today, and we're going to talk about something that we know happens to the best of us. If you've been in business long enough, and if you've had a steady stream of clients over the years, you've guaranteed you've run into a situation where you thought things were going well, and all of a sudden they start looking like they're going off the rails. Things are going south. And the question is, what do you do? How do you see it? What do you do to prevent it? What do you do if maybe there isn't anything to prevent and it just didn't turn out to be the best fit? All this kind of stuff happens. A lot of times it happens in professional service businesses because what the clients come to you for is your knowledge and your ability to do something that they don't have the ability to do, but they need. And so that's a relationship type of business. And if the relationship's going smoothly, it can be going smoothly for a while, and all of a sudden different people get involved, and then things start going off the rails. So what we want to talk about today is, how do you keep that from happening and you losing business or maybe suffering a bad reputation that wasn't necessarily your fault? So Travis, I know in your industry, it's a high touch business. You've got your project engineers out there, working intimately with the clients that you've chosen to do business with. Does this kind of thing happen to you?
Well, I would be lying if I said it didn't, but thankfully it doesn't happen often. In our world, the services world, consulting, all that kind of fun stuff. The thing that I've had, which has been a really interesting learning lesson over the years, is that everybody seems to have a slightly different perspective of what they consider to be the need, the value add, what is great, what's world-class service, right? So the thing that we've actually started to implement over the years is that when we bring a new team member on, for example,
right,
if, like you just said, if they're the ones that are interacting with the client, we actually sit them down and spell out to them what we expect. What does world-class service look like, right? Because I think, and still in this day and age, even though there's so much technology out there that can help us, it's amazing how many people I come across that just don't appreciate the soft skills. They don't appreciate, things as simple as like just good grammar and templating and formatting when it comes to a formal document. And, this topic we're getting into today of, what do you do when something goes south? It's funny because those are the people that I find get into those situations more often than not because they don't appreciate the little things.
Well, and you mentioned a word earlier that I think just encapsulates this whole discussion, which is expectations. And this is especially true when you're bringing on a new client and, they're happy that they made a choice finally. You're happy to have them. You're in that kind of early orientation stage. But how much time do you put towards setting expectations or ground rules so that the client knows exactly what they came and bought, what that looks like when it shows up? Or do you just kind of immediately jump into providing things and just wait to see if they see it and say, well, gee, I don't know if that's what I was looking for. Look, over the years, I've done hundreds of clients, and I have had a handful that midway through, just said, you know what, I'm not sure this is what I was looking for. And in one case, what they were actually looking for was a consultant. They wanted somebody to actually come in and do it all for them. And so I obviously didn't clearly articulate the fact that as a coach, I'm a guide. I'm somebody to help you, help the accountability factor, but I'm not the kind of person that's going to actually go in and do the work for you.
Yeah. And to that point, I hate to say it, and I've had this problem myself over the years. It has happened where at the end of the day, the person that's providing the service, I really look at, you're the one that should be driving the ship. Yes, a customer is bringing you in and they're paying you.
Right.
But at the end of the day, if you want to ensure that you leave that project or that experience with a good reputation intact, you really need to take control of those reins and guide your client through a successful project, successful engagement, whatever the heck it is.
Yeah.
So, one of the ways that we do it is at the point in which the client has said yes, right? The contracts are signed. We literally take them through a step-by-step engagement process so they know exactly what to expect. And it's everything from the way that we're going to communicate, how often we're going to communicate, what types of reporting are they going to get from us.
Mm-hmm.
All these little steps along the way. And then what we do is we send calendar invites out, and I'm given the secret sauce of our company. I mean, that these are the things that I have found over the years that people really like, because we hold their hand through the process. But the funny thing is, we have had a couple customers, one was this year, that just don't appreciate that. And they don't really want to be that engaged, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
Right.
you ever heard that phrase? Just throw it over the fence,
Yeah.
right?
Or, or my first boss at General Mills was fond of saying, "Don't tell me about the pain, just bring me the baby."
Yeah. But so in our world, what that usually looks like is you have your R&D group, research and development, engineering, right? Which is on the beginning cycle of product development. They sit there and design something. It's awesome. They're excited about it. It's got this new technology in it. And then they throw it over the fence, the proverbial fence, into manufacturing.
Right.
The manufacturing sitting there like, what the
What's
hell is this?
Right.
We can't
Right.
make this.
Right.
You idiots.
Right.
So I find that happens with some people and their customers.
All right. So let me break in here, because I just thought, what happens when you make your initial contact with the chief engineering officer or the CEO themselves? You hammer out the deal, they agree to it, they sign the contract. They're telling you kind of at a high level what it is they want out of this engagement, and they immediately turn everything over to lower level people who weren't involved in that initial discussion.
Happens all the time.
All right. So
all the freaking time.
How do you transfer the relationship at that high level down so that it maintains itself, so there's alignment?
So one of the best ways that I've found over the years to make sure that everybody's on the same page, especially if a new party is coming in after the fact, is to put stuff in writing. And as funny as that sounds, what I'll do is, let's say I'm talking to the CTO, and me and the CTO are the individual that kind of like, we scale up the project. We're the ones that conclude on what needs done. Agreement is made. It's, usually in our business referred to a statement of work. I'll take that statement of work and then make sure anybody else that is introduced to the project thereafter is given that same statement of work.
Right.
And then we'll usually have a meeting. We want to make sure that everybody's on the same page. And then the thing that I'll usually ask in that meeting is, whoever the new person is, let's call him John. John, is there anything else that you're seeing in the organization that you think, based on your perspective, we should be talking about? And almost always that person then brings up something that's near and dear and important to them.
Yes.
That was not on the CTO's, perspective.
Right.
So then what I could do, once again, is I loop that back around to the CTO and say, hey, do we have your approval to include this, right? The problem with that whole looping process is if you're not really on your game with your communication, it is so easy for things to fall through the cracks. And then what happens is people make assumptions that, oh, well, I told Travis that this was important to me. And then so in their head, they're like, well, ipso facto, that means they'll be doing it for me.
Right. Yes. Right? It's a done deal.
Right. So communication and really anchoring things in, making sure that expectations are clearly set is so important.
All right. So, let me ask you this, because this is kind of your business model. You cement these deals, get this thing going. Eventually, you're going to turn it over to your engineering team or whoever is assigned to go in there and actually perform that work. I'm assuming the client is going to send stuff down through their organization to whatever department is going to be having that engineer working with them, whatever project. So theoretically, after the initial, we're working together and this is what we need you to do, and you tell them what you're going to do, you could have two different groups of people actually doing the work. What happens if all of a sudden they start talking about stuff that's either the clients, this is what's important to me, don't worry about those guys, we never do that anyway, and they start coming up with this alternative plan? Does that ever happen to you? Do you ever find out later on that what your engineer has been instructed to do by the lower level people doesn't match up with what you came on board to do?
Unfortunately, it does. Because again, what really happens when you're working within an organization, whether you're an internal or an external resource? What happens is the people you're dealing with at that moment, their concern and their focus is what's directly important to them.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I would love to be able to tell you that everybody's thinking about what's most important to the key stakeholders like the CTO, but it's just simply not the case.
Right.
So
Right.
the best way to deal with that is when that comes up, you have to remind the person, hey, I hear you and I appreciate that. We need to go back to what we've been brought in for, which was XYZ. How can we accomplish this, which is what we're really being kind of tasked with,
Right.
along with what you need? And so in our world, what that usually looks like is, you ever heard that it's kind of an older phrase, world class versus good enough?
Yeah.
So in the medical device world, especially on the quality and compliance side, because the industry is so heavily regulated, you can certainly within, especially smaller businesses, you can get away with good enough as it relates to quality and compliance documentation and systems. It doesn't need to be world class.
Okay.
But the funny thing is, the reason I bring this up is because the C-level folks, they'll always tell you they want it world class, the best of the best. Everything needs to be right. But the people at the ground level are just like, we don't need that shit. Just come in here and get it done.
Right.
Right. We'll worry about it later.
Right.
And so this dichotomy of perspective exists within the same group of people. And you could have a small startup that's 20, 30 people deep. It's not a big company by any means.
Well, I where I thought you were going with this when you came up and said world class, I thought you were going to usher up this other old saying that's known as mission creep, which in a lot of consulting jobs happens if you're not really, really focused on boundaries for what you just said yes to. Everybody that enters the picture brings some other little attachment that they want you to stick onto the project. And all of a sudden the thing is like 50% bigger than what you agreed to when the client signed the contract.
Well, and look, I mean, you're 100% right. And we even have to control that on our end. So we have a whole ops team over here that does nothing but manage our projects through our PMO department to make sure that that's not happening. Because, for example, take like design work. Designers love to be creative, and in that moment of, I'm really pushing the boundaries in the envelope for what's kind of known to be, current within the industry versus what this technology may be able to do down the road. And so you'll find that if you're not controlling it, designers can kind of get off the rails real quick and like, oh, well, I thought this would be really cool to add on. Oh, well, how long did that take you to add that on? Oh, it wasn't that bad, 2 or 3 hours. But if you imagine you have 2 dozen people on a project, 2 to 3 hours per person, all of a sudden ends up being a notable expense.
Right. That's a big bill.
And
absolutely.
That's where, this topic that we're talking about today of what if you're working with a customer and that relationship kind of starts to go off the rails a little bit. I think in the kind of a example, at least that I was just giving with the design work, the first thing you've got to do is if you notice it, you got to call it out, right? So whether it's a customer issue that's occurring or even if it's an issue on your end, I really fully believe that if you try to sweep it under the rug and just kind of move on, even if, for example, let's say it was a you issue and you're like, oh shit, our team just worked 3 extra hours. Well, some people might look at that and say, just bill them. Who cares? They're not going to notice.
Right.
Wrong idea. They will always find out. The other thing is some people will just say, oh, don't bill them for it, but don't tell them. Okay. Again, wrong idea, because what you're doing there is by that lack of transparency, you're basically inadvertently telling your teammates at your company that it's okay not to be truthful with what's going on. So the way that we approach it, the way I see some other good companies approach it that are kind of in our space is you just be honest about it. You say, hey, Mr. Customer, we actually identified last week that this happened. Don't worry, you're not going to be charged for it. Here's what we're doing moving forward to fix that.
Okay. Mea culpa on the problem, but then tell them what the solution is.
Yeah, and that right there, that is the answer for almost every situation I've come across is Because look, at the end of the day, it's unrealistic to think that problems aren't going to arise in a relationship.
Right.
Right. They will arise. What's more important is how you handle them.
Yes.
So if you come to the situation saying, we recognize this, but that being said, we already have a solution for it. Here's what it is. Assuming you're good with it, we're just going to move forward. Right. It's amazing how many people appreciate that approach, and they don't even worry about the fact that there was an issue, because the issue at that point, it just doesn't mean anything. There's already a solution. We're moving forward. No big deal.
All right. So how do you monitor the work product that the relationship is based on, and maybe take a proactive stance if you see something happening? Because I mean, I can tell you in a lot of other clients that I've worked with, guess what the leading indicator is to something's not working right? What do you think happens that causes people to recognize that maybe the expectations are not in keeping with what the client wants, or something's happened to the relationship?
Someone starts yelling at them.
Actually, that would be a good thing, because at least they would know. No, what I'm talking about is all of a sudden the communication starts becoming sporadic. You reach out to somebody, make a request, a follow-up, and a week goes by and you don't hear anything.
Yes, they're ghosting you.
They're ghosting you. Or you ask for something specific, and what you get back is a variation of that, or in some cases, something completely different, almost like they're using your entree as a platform to complain about something. So when the communication starts getting wonky early on, to me, I think that's like the leading indicator that, okay, we have an issue here that maybe email's not the right thing for. Maybe that's where you jump on the phone, or you go pay your customer a visit if they're in your local market, to figure out is what's bubbling up under the surface.
Well, and as you kind of outlined, if all of a sudden you start noticing a change in the communication, doesn't even mean that they're just kind of going cold turkey on you.
Mm-hmm.
I think the big piece is that relationship from your customer's perspective, are they just pulling back because they're not identifying that's a good use of their time? Right.
Could be.
So I think that's some good insight, because if you're having multiple conversations with someone a week, and then all of a sudden it's like a month now and you can't get a hold of someone, they're not returning your calls
right.
or emails, then, I would say that's a good indicator that you've done messed up.
Well, and, I think follow-up is always one of the best business practices you can get involved in. But for people that follow up too much without any real substance for their follow-up, it's kind of like a business version of harassment.
Well,
and
it's a pain in the ass.
Yeah. And then people are like, well, I'm not taking his calls because he doesn't have anything valuable to say anyway. I'll just catch up with him next week.
Right.
So there are a lot of things that start to show up in the flow of communication that was established when you first started working together, that if that becomes altered, you can almost guarantee that there's a reason for that. And is the reason just because they're traveling a lot and they don't have time? Or is the reason that there's something they don't like, and rather than get on the phone or get on email and lay it out, they're just hoping, like you said earlier, they're using one of those tactics. Well, we'll just hope it goes away, that they get back on track.
So this was, I don't know, maybe 2018. I had a situation where there was a COO that I was working with, had known this guy for quite some time. And it just all of a sudden, it was like the relationship kind of went stale, which was a little weird. And, I kind of let it go because I didn't want to jump to conclusions. And this guy was super busy. The company was IPOing at the time. So I made the assumption, I was like, oh, what do I know? Right. I mean, he's probably just swamped. So a couple months later, I still couldn't get a hold of this person. We had active projects going on with the company, and he was my main point of contact.
Okay.
So I wrote him a letter. Now, my office, in comparison to where his office was, is maybe 15 minutes down the road.
Mm-hmm.
But he tends to be a little old school, which I like, because I think sometimes that, these older processes and approaches, which is what I'm about to describe, with the right people, it goes over well.
Yeah.
So long story, I wrote him a letter, sent it out via snail mail, and within less than a week, he responded. He called me. He goes, "Hey, what's going on? What's this letter all about? And the funniest thing was, and I want to make sure I don't say his name, but I was like,
Right.
I was like, Jeff, I've been calling you for no joke, sending you emails for like 2 months now. I was like, I get that you're busy. I was like, but I just want to make sure we still. He goes, yeah, let's go grab some lunch. And you know what the big learning lesson was in that moment? I thought there was a huge issue, and I completely made that issue up in my head.
Right. Yes.
There was no issue there. It just,
Right.
the dude was really, really busy, you know? And so that's a good cautionary tale for people, especially that are in sales, that sometimes it really isn't you. Sometimes it's just the other person has a lot going on.
All right. So I think getting back to the initial part of the relationship, if it's a new client, I think one of the things that you can do to help guard yourself against that is to really be able to take the pulse of that client, how they communicate, how they make decisions, how involved are they in the process, because that's going to help you figure out later on when there's a lot going on and you're not getting the direction, you're not getting the feedback, you're not getting those little warm and fuzzies that tells you everything is on track. Then, like you just described, you won't be reading in anything that's not really there. Because some people are basically, if they see everything working to their expectation, there's like, okay, I got no reason to talk. If something happens, I'll get a hold of them. But other than that, we're okay. The only problem is that doesn't convey to the other party that they're okay very well.
Right. Well, so have you had a situation prior where, whether it was a customer of yours or someone else's customer, where they had been working with him, maybe it was a new customer, and just real quickly out the gate, there were just issues, and maybe they even try to confront it, and then the issues just continue. I would just be curious, like, how do you handle that kind of a situation? Like, what did that person do in that moment to kind of try to, save the baby before the bathwater was thrown out?
All right, I'll tell you, this was probably about 5 years ago. I met with a company in Huntington Beach, and they had heard I gave a public speech to a business organization, and one of their people was there and came back and said, hey, you ought to talk to this guy. And so I ended up going over to their office and meeting them and talking with them. Everything was going perfectly, okay, according to what I thought at the time. The engagement itself lasted less than 2 months, which is ridiculous, considering people that come to me end up staying a year and a half or more, but 2 months. And so what we found out was their expectations of what I was actually going to do were completely off the rails compared to what I had actually sat and talked to them about. And I sat back and I thought, okay, how could I have possibly screwed up the communication at that point in time? And here's what
self-reflection.
Oh, yeah.
Wonderful.
Well, so what I found out was the guy that owned the firm, okay, was very, very disconnected from the daily ebb and flow. He needed to be there for large decisions that required, writing checks and stuff like that. But other than that, he wasn't really involved in the day-to-day. He had people there. He trusted them. They were good. So let him go. The person that I was doing the talking with, who needed the particular help, had not conveyed that to the person at the top, who was basically, writing the check and saying, okay, what are we getting for it? So there was an internal communication breakdown that I didn't see, because I was talking to one person at this point, talking to the other, didn't have them both in the same room at the same time. And so finally, when the owner of the company came to me and said, look, I don't think this is going to work. I mean, they're really not getting anything out of these sessions. And I asked him, I said, well, what were you looking for? What were you expecting? He says, oh, we thought we were hiring somebody to come in and actually do it. They would set up shop and just be an independent contractor for us. And so I walked back and I thought, all right, let's just say, I mean, it's over with, fine, no big deal. How do I not step in that hole again? What do I have to do to either clearly articulate what I'm bringing to the party, or equally as importantly, how do I vet what they're telling me what they want? That's what they actually want. That's what I ended up having to work on, the vetting process.
So have you ever in these discussions, you're vetting a new customer, you're kind of hearing them out on what their need is. Have you ever just thought about saying, so Jim, I just want to make sure I'm being clear here with what I'm capable of doing versus what I'm not. So I'm a coach. I do this, this, this. I'm not a consultant. And a consultant is this, this, this. Is that in alignment with what you're looking for?
I have had conversations that have gone in that direction. I don't know that I would have phrased them exactly that way, but I've had situations where I would sit back and say, okay, this is what I'm hearing you say that you want. Is that right? I'm going to play it back to you in my words. Tell me if I'm getting it right. If I'm not getting it right, then I'll go back and ask more questions. But
yeah, that's so smooth. It's
am I getting it?
Business Yoda comes out again.
Am I getting it right? And if they say, yeah, that's exactly what I want. So, okay, here's how I would approach that. This is where we're going to start. This is what our sessions are going to look like. This is what my job is, to move you down this development highway to get you what you want. Is that what you're thinking about? And if they say yes to that, then I say, okay, then the only reason it could break down later on is that if they start realizing that it's harder than it is, which most of the time it always is, and they just decide they don't want to keep doing it. Okay, people do that. People give up. Right. Sometimes I can't convince them to stay on the program. But early on, that vetting of, is this what I heard and this is what I'm doing? Is this what you want? That at least forces them to commit to the actual work product that I'm going to be providing. And if they do that, then I know that barring any really weird stuff, okay, I had one lady about 8 years ago, great customer, had a really interesting business. What I found out 7 months in was that she really needed medical help, therapy.
A therapist.
Yeah. And I told her, and I said, look, if you don't have one, I'll help you find them. If you can find one, great. But I said, we really should put this on hold until you deal with some of this stuff that you're telling me about, because I don't have any tools for that. I'm not trained for that. I can't serve you to the best of my ability on that lane of the highway. You need to go find, and she did. And I think I hope it helped her. I don't know. We never really kind of, hooked up and continued on later on, which I know that happens. I mean, once people move into a different direction, a lot of times they never come back. But I think it's that awareness up front, or what exactly are you looking for? And once you tell me, I can tell you what I'm going to do for that. And if you have that verbal commitment, you're probably 95% okay. But if the communication isn't clear and the vetting process, the Q&A, isn't robust enough to really understand what they're dealing with. Oh, and here's the one that's even worse. Frequently, I will run into people who can't tell me what they want. What they can tell me is what they don't want. So now I have to re-engineer the whole conversation and say, okay, you're telling me you don't want this, 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 and this. Okay, that means you really want A, B, and C. Is that what you're looking for?
Yeah,
then it's another way of vetting the intention of the client. And I think that is so important, because if you start off that way and they know what they're getting out of it and you know what you're putting into it, the chances of it going south are going to be rare.
And that's why it's so important to put everything in writing. So for example, when we have meetings with customers, when we're on project, Z over here in our PMO, she literally is taking minutes during that meeting. So anything that's discussed and or anything that's agreed upon is taken down in those minutes. And then those minutes are shared amongst anyone who was in that meeting, as well as anyone who was has signing authority for that project.
Right.
And yes, it is some extra work. No, it's not required. But I will tell you this, on more than one occasion, that has saved us from either being in a situation where we were working down a road the client didn't think we should have been doing,
right,
and or just catching something up front, right? And so that little piece, and the funny thing is, this is not like world-renowned activity here. Like, this isn't mind-blowing,
right.
Like, holy crap, you took notes in a meeting.
Right.
But the funny thing is, it's amazing how many people will take notes and then literally do nothing with it. So the way I look at it is, it's the act of action, taking those notes and then dispersing them amongst the group that was involved,
right,
to get exactly what you're talking about, which is agreement. And
Well,
that right.
look, that when we're all kids, or at least I did when I was a kid, because we didn't have, internet and stuff like that. You played that telephone game, right? You tell the person next to you something, they tell somebody. By the time it gets around a circle of 6 or 8 kids, the story that's being piped into your left ear is somewhat too completely different than what you told the person that started the process. And I think especially in any kind of a business where you're either a project manager, you're kind of overseeing and coordinating. I have 2 clients now that are in the entertainment industry. And so they put on events, concerts, things like that. They're dealing with half a dozen or more different people, companies, artists, things like that. You've got to have some way of making sure everybody's on the same page all the time. Because if you don't, that's when people start going off the rails, when they either don't hear anything or what they hear isn't in sync with what they thought they said yes to.
Well, so it's interesting how you bring up the telephone game. So I too, as a child, as you would remember, grew up without the internet, and we played that game as well. And the funny thing was, I actually got busted one time because I was the little jerk who was in the line of the communication.
Right.
And be like, I've got Tommy coming into my left ear saying, "Hey, we're all meeting over at the snack bar at 4:00." And then I would be telling Jack on my other side to be like, "Jack, we're not going to the snack bar. We're all going home." Just to mess. But
so
you
were an instigator. You were a troublemaker.
Yeah, but the funny thing was, what I didn't account for, which is why I'm telling the story, because this happened at a customer, was Jack was just like, "Well, that doesn't make sense," and literally looked around me to the other guy on my side, and he goes, "What did you tell him?" And the funny thing was, we had a similar situation. This was last year, happened with a customer where there was a different person who signed on to the project, right? So VP level guy. We're then in a meeting. We've been on the project for like a month or so, and we're in this meeting, and one of his subordinates, a director, is telling us to do something. And I know for damn well sure that's not what we should be doing.
Oh, really?
Well, guess what? Like I had said earlier, we've been taking notes. So this time when I send the notes out, I CC the VP on these notes because I know this guy's really thorough. Sure enough, within like half a day, he responds, "Yeah, thanks for the notes. Saw that annotation about XYZ. Yeah, please don't do that."
Right. Well, so what that really tells me is that in any initial engagement or new project with an existing client, you've really got to not only ask the right questions and be very clear about what they're asking you to do and what you're going to be providing, but to your point, write it down, because you never know when you might be called into an update meeting and people have gotten off the rails and they're talking about stuff that's completely different than the original conversation that set that project into motion. And having it written down is a way to recenter yourself and say, okay, here's what we originally agreed to. Now, has it changed? Has everybody agreed we don't want to do this anymore? Or are you guys kind of getting off into other areas and you've kind of lost sight of what we originally came together for? So yeah, I think that's excellent advice. And not a lot of people do it. Everybody wants to find these little apps on their phone so they can take notes in the moment. Shit, just take a legal pad with you and a pen and just write the stuff down.
Well, so that's the advantage, though, of following up with the written word, right? Is because just so few people actually do that and have a willingness to be that thorough.
Yeah, you're going to stand out just by doing it on a regular basis. Absolutely.
Right. So the other thing I wanted to bring up real quick was, in this topic that we're covering today, which is you have a relationship. I know we've been talking a lot about client relationships, but how do you address situations when they just go awry? So we had a situation last year, a very small company. I mean, it was literally 3 or 4 people that had just kind of formed this company. They were basically running off their own dollars. Long story short, we ended up, unfortunately, having to fire them about 3 weeks into the project. That was the first time I've ever had to do that in my career. Now, I've thankfully not often. I have to be careful how I choose my words here. But I have fired other clients before. It's been seldom, but never that quick into an interaction.
And what was it? What did you discover that made you go to that length?
Because every single time we talked to them, things would change. And then when they would change, there was very little accountability on their end for the fact that they were changing things. Right. So, and thankfully, again, we had things in writing. Right. I mean, look, for those who are listening, me personally, I would never do anything in business without also having it in writing for what that's worth.
Right.
And thankfully, in this situation, this small customer of ours, it was like every time I know we said that, but here's what we need to do. It's like, shithead Steve, you literally just told me this 24 hours ago, and we've been working that whole time.
Right.
Oh yeah. But can you maybe just help us out this one time and not bill us for that? It's like, no.
So they're doing what we used to call spitballing, and in coming up with different scenarios, different ideas, and they want to put them immediately into practice without really vetting whether it's a smart idea or not. And they want to do it on your dime.
So in that situation, it was a complete emotional response. Yeah, let's do that. Go, go, go. Well, we go. And then very quickly thereafter, it's like, oh, well, you know what? We're going to change tune, and we're just going to completely divert the project this way.
Right.
And after, no joke, in a period of 3 weeks, that happened 4 different times.
Oh my God.
And then one of the other ones was the just death of the committee. We'd have
they never could make a decision.
They could never make a freaking decision. And so here was the other thing that was a really interesting learning lesson. There were 4 guys in this company. They had an interesting idea, but all 4 guys had a 25% stake in the company. So try to guess the problem that created.
Yeah, they all technically had an equal share by virtue of their equity, but they didn't have a hierarchy that said who was the final, final arbiter of the decision. And so nothing ever got decided on.
And no one was really willing to stand up and be that person.
Right.
So what it basically meant was we would have a meeting, a decision would then get made, but then they'd be like, we're going to talk amongst us. We'll get back to you here in about an hour. It's like, dude, I just had a meeting with you for 2 hours. What do you need? You need to have another hour meeting yourselves?
Right.
So we ended up removing maybe that's more of the polite way to refer to it. We removed ourselves from that situation immediately.
Yeah. I mean, but look, you're in business to provide a service and to make money doing it. And if your P&L for that client is just, going into negative early on because of that kind of stuff, then that's a hard decision. But at some point you have to kind of draw the line,
Well, and even in those moments, which, it's unfortunate, right? I mean, one of our core tenets, our core values here in the company is reputation over profits. And so we're really focused on doing the right thing, coming through, executing. But that being said, we can't help you, the customer, run your business. I mean, at the end of the day, it's like, it's your business.
Right.
So that was an unfortunate situation. However, I would tell you that looking back on it, I think the way that we removed ourselves was professional. And at the end of the day, that's what I'm going to look at is, 98% of the time it's going to go well. The 2%, you still have to exit out of whatever that situation is, respectful of the other people involved.
Right.
So I don't know. And this whole idea of, when you have a relationship that's kind of dwindling, and what if you've done everything that you can, right? You've given these salvos back. Maybe you've even cut them deals, right, to try to salvage the relationship, and it's just not working. What do you do at that point?
Well, okay. So one of the things that when I first started coaching and I was working in kind of the marketing side of things, one of the things we learned was this concept called client lifetime value. And what that basically means is you look at how long clients typically stay with you for whatever it is you do, and you figure out how much you earn from them during that time. That becomes your client lifetime value. That's what you use to determine what your marketing spend should be to acquire a client that is going to do business with you over a period of time. What I realized out of that was there's a back end to that, meaning you could have a lifetime value, but that also means clients have a lifetime limit. Depending on what you do, they're only going to stay with you for so long on average. And so I know what mine is for my business. And when clients start to go beyond that, unless they're going through some hierarchical change or some culture change or something else that keeps the engagement alive, the chances are it might start to plateau. And when it plateaus, if the client's not strong enough to be able to say, okay, look, we've had a great time for 3 years now, but we probably ought to just, end it. They're just going to let it ride, but they're going to stop participating. They're going to stop coming to it with the same gusto that they did when they started. So when I'm in that situation, sometimes what you have to do is basically just say, hey, Tom, things have, I've been trying to keep us moving forward, but it doesn't seem like you're engaged like you used to be. Is it time to call it quits on this?
I've got to say that makes sense. I've literally, I was 0 days old when I heard that. I've never heard that phrase before. And the funny thing is
client lifetime value.
Yeah. And I'm really scratching my head because I have no idea what that value would be for us, meaning how long do we typically have a client for and what is the value that's associated with that?
That's a huge number because it literally can change how you think about what you should be spending from a marketing standpoint to acquire new ones.
Well, sure.
Yeah.
But it also gives you on an average, right, an idea as to how long is this relationship going to go for,
right,
for other planning purposes.
Right. Very few business relationships from a fundamental business exchange, not just, hey, you've known this guy for 10, 15 years. He's now inviting you to his kid's wedding, all that kind of, social type stuff. But from a fundamental business exchange, pretty much no business was designed to last forever. People come and go. People have been with an insurance company for 10 years and all of a sudden they find out they've been paying a premium and they really shouldn't, and the market's changed. And so now they go out and find somebody new. So that kind of stuff happens all the time. For me, I think what's more important is that the owner of the company, you understand what that time span looks like. Sometimes it makes sense to stop because you can't bring any more to the party. You've exhausted everything you know how to do. And they're not getting anything out of it either. So do you just keep billing them and hoping that nothing's going to happen? Or do you finally sit down with them and say, look, here's what we got done. Here's where you are today. Maybe you should be looking at somebody else to take you to the next chapter, but we fulfilled what we started 2 or 3 years ago. And unless you tell me you want to keep going and do something new, maybe it's time, we call an end to this.
It's really weird how you just described that. I had a sales partner in my past life at a former employer of mine who did exactly what you just said.
Yeah.
So if we knew we were taking on a project for 6 months and then all of a sudden we're at the 6-month mark, but there's still work there.
Right.
My peer, I guess you would call it that, his whole approach was let it ride. He's like, don't even talk to the client.
Right.
Don't ask about the project.
Right.
Don't ask about billing. He's like, just let it go. He goes,
right.
You know what? If we can keep billing and they're paying and the work is getting done, he goes, you might get 3, 4, 5 extra months out of it. And I don't know, that always kind of sat with me a little weird. I get it. At the end of the day, I guess if you're providing a service and that service continues to be needed, but it just always seemed a little sleazy to me.
Well, to me, the critical difference is the client actively engaged? Do you see a difference between how they're showing out, how they're getting involved, what they're doing for their side of the project, like you did the first 30 days when you're working with them? If that has waned, or if they've stretched things out, now instead of having a monthly meeting, you're having a quarterly meeting, or maybe they've taken the project that was on their desk that they were responsible for, they've handed it off to a lower level minion to do it. All of those things will start to tell you that maybe it's still important, but maybe it's not at the level you think it is because of some of those changes that are taking place.
Father, you should not be using the word minion anymore.
Oh, really? I didn't realize that. Is that a bad word? I don't, I'm not, yeah, what the heck?
I
All
don't
right.
know
So
what
listen, have we kind of gotten around to the end of this thing in terms of kind of what you should be looking for, maybe what best practices you should be employing to keep things on the straight and narrow until for whatever reason you should just let them go?
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, you've brought this up a couple times. I think we've talked about it in a couple circles here that if you're setting expectations at the beginning and then you're communicating consistently, which includes the written word,
Right.
you're definitely going to position yourself better to not find yourself in situations where you have customer relationships failing.
Right.
The reality is it's going to happen every once in a while. And to your point that you had shared earlier, I think you just have to stick up for yourself and or just address the elephant in the room and say, hey, you know what? This isn't working out. Appreciate the opportunity. After XYZ is done, I think we just kind of part ways,
right. Yeah. I think when you do that, you leave on a more professional note, and they tend to think of you higher after you're gone than badmouth you because of all the stuff they didn't like you were doing. So,
right.
All right, folks, listen, hopefully you got some really good tips out of this kind of interesting, topic. The whole idea of having clients that are more relational in nature. You work with them over long periods of time, but does the relationship always maintain the high road, or does it get off in the weeds someplace, or do people start feeling differently about working with you? And if that happens, do you know what to do about it? So hopefully you got what you needed out of today's episode in that regard. All right. As we talk about every week, we're on at 4 p.m. on Tuesdays with brand new material. So stay with us. You can hear us on iTunes or Google Podcast or Spreaker or iHeart. I mean, there's like 12 or 15 different major platforms out there. Whatever one you choose, we're on it. You just got to type in Business Wingmen and you'll find our page. So thanks for being with us. We hope you join us next week. And from the podcast studio here, I'm Steve Smith, and Travis is my co-host today. Have a great rest of your week. We'll talk to you next week.